Welcome into episode 213 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin. Bridget and Scott, Trent Frederic and Jeremy Swayman are in the fold going forward with the Boston Bruins. Scott, would you like to unravel how that came to be?
Yeah, well, both were scheduled for arbitration hearings. Swayman actually went to one. They had the hearing on Sunday. Arbitrator made his ruling on Tuesday and gave Swayman a 1 year, $3.475 million contract, which was basically right in the middle of where the Bruins came in, which was $2 million, which, everyone knows is on the low side, but that's how arbitration works. Swayman and his agent came in at 4.8, which everyone knows is on the high side. But again, that's how you approach these things. The Bruins reportedly actually could have accepted it as a 2-year deal, which we can unravel a little later because that's kind of interesting. Trent Frederic, they avoided arbitration. His hearing was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. And on Tuesday morning, we got the news that the Bruins and Frederic had reached a 2-year deal worth $2.3 million per year. So, yeah, everyone's now signed. They have their full roster. What we can get into more is it does get interesting because if you look at like their 23-man roster right now, which is, maximum 23 guys, it's actually a little over the cap by about $375,000. So you can go with a 22-man roster or potentially make some other move if you wanted to stick with 23. But yeah, they at least have all the guys that they needed to get signed are at least signed now, and they have a full roster.
Yeah, guys, sorry for if you're watching on YouTube, the sun went in, so now I'm like in a dark. It looks like I'm in like a cave somewhere, but just hoping the sun comes back out in a sec. By the way, it got really cold. Like, I don't know, it already feels like fall. Maybe it's because I was in New Hampshire, but all of a sudden I'm waking up and I'm like heating my slippers and I'm putting on my robe and I'm like, what happened to summer? It was August 1st. Like, what the hell? But sorry, to go back to the salary cap situation the Bruins are in after this. Scott, I don't know if you even know the answer to it. Because when you said they could have made the Swayman thing a 2-year deal, does that mean like for the same amount of money both years, or like somehow split it to be cap compliant this year and push some of it to next year?
No, for the same amount of money. And basically, I think the reason that is because it's Swayman, the player, who took it to arbitration or officially filed for arbitration. So the team would get the option. It's kind of fascinating because like 3.475 is really fair, and you would have to think if Swayman has a really good season, it's going to cost more than that next year. But I wonder if the reason that they kept it at 1 year is to try to kind of keep a good relationship with Swayman, because if he thinks 3.475 is a little low, then he's probably not going to be thrilled if he's kind of stuck with that for 2 years. So maybe it's a little bit of a kind of handshake. Hey, we had to play hardball this year because of our cap situation. No one really liked it, but we'll take care of you next year. Like we'll work towards that longer term extension type thing. That's sort of my best guess, but you could also go the other way and say like, well, maybe it's a continuation of them playing hardball because they can now have him as a restricted free agent again next year and, potentially do like a 2-year deal, then another bridge deal type thing. And like, so I guess you could kind of take that both ways, but the more optimistic side would be that it's to kind of help keep a good relationship with Swayman.
Yeah, I can't tell. I kind of actually lean towards it might be that second part that you said about, continuing to be able to kind of have control over the situation for another season. But either way, I think when we originally were talking cap at the very end of the season, we were talking about what the calculated price would be for Swayman. And if I'm correct in remembering, I think it was 30.5 was pretty much what we came up with. So it's just below that. Obviously, Swayman asked for 4.8, which is a lot, and I don't know how the Bruins would have been able to make that work with the cap if he had gotten closer to that number, say if he got awarded 4.5 million a season. That would have made things a lot tougher on the cap situation, because as of right now, being $375,000 over the cap, I mean, that's a lot of money to us, but like in terms of cap, that's not that much. Like there's ways to fix that. And we're going to get into that too, what the Bruins can do to try to get under the cap. Now we've actually kind of got a better picture of what this team looks like, because it seems like moves are kind of settled. Bergeron's retired. The one thing we're still waiting on is the Krejci decision, but we kind of think we already know what it is. So I think we have a good understanding now of where their cap situation is. It looks like they're going to be able to get under it. And with the team that they have now, besides maybe having to waive Ian Mitchell or, another one of their bottom players on the roster. So I don't know what you guys thought. And Trent Frederic's contract, I think, was fair as well. Frederic mentioned at the end of the season that he was hoping that negotiations would go well, and he wanted to stay in Boston. So he didn't want a drama-filled arbitration. He didn't go to one, so that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think Frederic's 2.8 was a very fair number for both sides, and I think that, yeah, I mean, it's simply put, it was very fair. I think that he very well could exceed that value, but he also could, based on last year's roster being so strong and everybody having career years, if he comes back down to earth, then maybe you look at it and you say, all right, well, it's 2.8. It's not killing us on the books. And but I definitely think for somebody who's, he's an interesting player, because at least in my mind, I kind of feel like he's still like a younger player, and he is. What is he, 23, 24 years old? But he's been on the Bruins for, I mean, I think his rookie year was when he fought Brandon Tanev against Winnipeg in Boston when his dad was going crazy in the stands. Was that the 2018-2019 season, or the 2017-2018 season even? Like, it's been a while since he's been a pro.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards that being 18-19, but
yeah. It was 18-19. He played 15 games, but then in the 2020 season, obviously a weird season, he only played 2 games. So I don't know, like that's kind of like a wash a little bit, but then he started getting more time each year after that until he played 79 games this past season.
He's 24 years old. Is that what he is, Bridget? 24? 25?
I accidentally exited out of it.
That's okay. I mean,
he's 25. He's 25.
25. So, my point is 2.8 million for a guy who the Bruins hope is ready to come into his own and really hit his stride and enter the prime of his career. If he can be the player that he was last year, if not better than and more, as you grow with confidence and tenure in the league and crafting your skill at this level, I think that 2.8 for, even though it's for a couple of years, could be good value the next 2 seasons for him.
Yeah, just to correct it, it's 2.3 per year, so even better for the Bruins. And they were closer together to start. Frederic and his agent filed at 2.9 for the arbitration hearing, and the Bruins were at like 1.4, so a little easier to like find a clear middle ground, and it actually ended up a little closer to Frederic's number. So that, I'm sure he's, all things considered, relatively happy. And, I think last season established himself as a really solid third line winger, and that's good money for a third line winger. Like that's, just a deal that I think everyone should be fairly happy with. And now he's going to get a chance, we think, to see if he can prove himself as a third line center. He's going to be competing for that job. It likely will be either him or Morgan Geekie, maybe an outside shot for Merkulov or McLaughlin or Beecher. I think more likely those guys are probably aiming at fourth line jobs, but he's kind of one of the 2 guys who has an inside track to that job. And we saw him a little bit at center down the stretch last year and in the playoffs when Bergeron and Krejci were injured. So he'll get more of a run there, and that's, a way he can build his value even more for when this contract's up in 2 years. If he's able to keep growing, keep producing, take on more minutes because, he had good production last year, but was still playing under 12 minutes a game. So especially if he moves to center, that number is going to go up. He could play 14 minutes a game this year, as a third line center. So, it's a bit of a bridge deal. What is different about this versus Swayman is Frederic will be an unrestricted free agent at the end of this. So, 2 years to kind of prove himself and either, eventually work towards probably a longer term deal with the Bruins or build his market, builds his value for the open market if he ultimately gets there.
Yeah, 2.3, you're right, Scott. I don't know why I thought 2.8, but as I look at that, it's even, to your point, it's even better.
He's one of those guys that, like, if you think back, and it does feel like a long time ago now, but if you think back a few seasons ago, we had the same questions about him cracking the lineup and staying there as we did for someone like Jack Stanika, who's obviously not in Boston anymore. So we had those similar questions about what Trent Frederic could do. Was he actually going to be able to figure out the NHL speed of the game? Because he had some difficulties transitioning, really. And this past season, playing almost a full season, 17 goals, 14 assists, 31 points. Like, he had his best year of his career, and he looked versatile. He looked like someone that, you could rely on for wing and potentially center, but also for some skill plays and some brute plays. Like, he has a little bit of everything to his game, and we've watched him be able to make that jump. It wasn't super quickly, but now that he's there, you do feel more comfortable giving him more ice time, which he's going to need this season, especially if they're going to be moving him to center at certain points. And he's one of those guys who went from, you felt like he could have been like in and out, called up and down, to now you feel like he's pretty safe and secure in his role and his spot in the roster. So you're looking at other players that were thinking, okay, well, what if this person gets sent down, waived, whatnot? But he seems to be, I would say he's pretty safe at this point. He's done enough to, over the last year, pretty much secure his role and not have to deal with that kind of stress of, am I going to go up? Am I going to go down? He's transitioned into that everyday player for the Bruins. So the deal, I think, makes sense in financially for the Bruins side. And Frederic, he was, according to himself, wasn't going to be a huge part of the negotiations. He was leaving that to his agent. I don't know how much he's hands-on with any of his contract stuff. He's kind of like I play the hockey, you guys deal with it kind of person. So, and he was another thing that stuck out to me. For some reason, I really have a very strong memory of talking to Frederic on breakup day. I feel like I remember the whole conversation for some reason. But he also mentioned that, because I asked him about the potential of playing more minutes at center if guys moved on. And he was one of the only people who didn't answer the question like, oh no, we want Bergie to come back. He's like, no, that'd be like, I want more time at center. So he's looking forward to being able to get those minutes down the middle.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely has his spot secured entering the season, but you still got to keep it there. I mean, I remember this time last year. I mean, I'll speak for myself. I remember this time going into this time last year, I was very down on the player because he hadn't really done much with his opportunity. And then last preseason, in a preseason where I felt as though he was fighting for a job, I thought he was very lackluster. And we talked about it on the podcast, and he had one of the worst camps, I thought, of any Bruin last fall. But fortunately for him, once the puck dropped for the regular season, he had a career year, and that definitely has built confidence in me watching him, and it's definitely gotten him a spot in this roster going forward. That said, I still want to see him continue to develop and be consistent. Like, can he do it again? Like, that's the question. And it was a great last year. Everybody had career years. Can he take that next step with a lesser roster? And I kind of do want to see more of it. Is my point.
Can I give a quick shout out to Charlie Coyle too? Because I feel like Charlie Coyle last year was one of the people that I always notice around Frederic. And Frederic talked about how Coyle like really helped him in his development. And you think about Coyle, he's another center that was the third line center last year. He's probably going to be important to Frederic's development this year as well.
Yeah, and that leads me right into my point, which is, can Frederic now be a driver on a line? Because last year he fit in really well playing off Coyle and off Taylor Hall a lot. And those are two really good guys to have next to you on a third line. Hall especially helps set up a lot of those chances that Frederic ends up finishing for his career high 17 goals. Okay, well, Taylor Hall's gone. Charlie Coyle's moving up in the lineup. If you're centering that third line, then it's your line. So that's going to be, he at times has done that on the fourth line, been fourth line center, but that's a little different. Third line center, like we've talked about it a ton in the past, how important third lines are. So that's, if he wins that job, like that's the next challenge is now, can you be the guy? Can you be the leader on the line? Can you, help set up your wings in addition to finishing your own chances? Because we saw last year, like, okay, he can finish chances. He has a pretty good shot. I think he's good defensively. I think Trent Frederic has, that's probably been an underrated part of his game, but I think has been pretty strong for a couple of years now. We've seen him get more involved on the penalty kill. But, third line has to score, especially on a team that might be, a man or two short in the top six. Like you're going to need some contributions from the third line. Doesn't have to be the greatest scoring third line of all time. Doesn't have to even match last year's, but you've got to contribute offensively. It can't, your third and fourth lines can't both just be shut down, try to play low event hockey. Like that third line's got to put up some points. And if Frederic's going to be the center, he's got to, be someone who helps create those chances and drive offense.
And Scott, this actually, I just was thinking of the article you posted where you kind of try to put the lines together the way they might be right now. And looking at that third line, it would be Frederic with Boqvist and Morgan Geekie, and that's a young line. Like that's Frederic and Geekie are 25, and Boqvist is 24, I think. So that's a young third line. I would say of those three, Frederic is the more established of them, and Morgan Geekie is also someone that can play center. So that, you kind of see the dynamics of that line as it's going to have to prove itself a lot, because that's three players who have never played with each other before. They're all in their mid-20s. And two of them might want to be the center of that line. So it's going to have an interesting dynamic if that's what the line looks like.
Yeah.
And
go ahead, Scott.
And it could be, Lauko who forces his way up there instead of a Boqvist, or, or even one of the younger guys, like Lysell or Merkulov or whatever. Like, there's clearly competition there, but Frederic is someone that, at least on paper, you look at and lock him in. Like, it would be, it'd be really disappointing if, like, a week or two out from the season, we're like, is Frederic going to end up on the fourth line instead? Like, that would not be good. Like, he's got to be a third liner, and along with Geekie, or, if they end up on the same line, like, be one of the guys who drives that. He should be pretty locked into that spot.
Yeah, and that's one of those players that you mentioned, and others, like, that's part of what I'm really excited for this season. And I've mentioned it to you guys in the past, like, the way that last season ended, clearly it left a really sour taste in everybody's mouth. And it's like, well, now we got to sit through another regular season. How can another regular season possibly top the one we just watched? And from a success standpoint, it can't. But from an entertainment standpoint and like a storyline standpoint, it certainly can, because last year the storyline was they just keep winning. But next year the storyline is going to be, kind of fresh face line of mid-20s, on a third line. Can they be something? Can Pavel Zacha emerge as a true number one or number two, bona fide number two center? Like there's can Merkulov enter the fold? Can Lysell enter the fold? Like, does anybody from the system emerge? And those are storylines that we didn't have the opportunity to see last year because they were such a well-oiled machine that going into next year, that's going to be fun to watch and definitely interesting. And I definitely feel like, look, there's much to be desired right now at center ice. Even if Zacha and Coyle and Frederic or Geeky or whomever end up being like having really strong seasons, like there's still a guy short up the middle, top 6 guy up the middle short. That said, there's not a lot of expectations for some of these players, but some of these players and some of these combinations get in this system with more minutes from their previous roles, whether it was in Boston or elsewhere. There's a pretty decent ceiling for some of these young players. I mean, Morgan Geeky and Trent Frederic having the seasons that they've had in the past with the limited minutes that they've had. I mean, Scott, you mentioned Frederic was under 12 minutes a game or something like that, and he's almost a 20 goal scorer. So, I mean, it's exciting to watch. Bridget, to your point earlier, like you're kind of seeing what this team might look like in the fall, and short of a couple of players emerging in camp and maybe that coming out of like a Merkulov or a Lysell, which I mean that'd be a very not unexpected, but I don't think it's necessarily like on the radar right now that they'll crack the team out of camp. But you're kind of looking at what we're going to see in the fall, and if this is what we're looking at in the fall, am I expecting them to win a President's Trophy? Nope. Do I need them to? Certainly not. Certainly not. Not after last year. But I do think the team's competitive. I think the personnel's a little bit shy up front, but I think they're competitive, and I'm really interested to see how a lot of these players do with accelerated roles and bigger roles on a team that they haven't had before.
Yeah, and when you think about that line in particular, you nailed it, Brian. Like those are going to be a big step up probably in minutes and in like their importance because than they've ever had, minus Frederic because he's played a third line role before. But Boqvist was somebody that hasn't quite emerged yet the way that some people expected him to, though he's heading in that direction, hopefully. And he also has a lot of speed. So that line, with as young as it is, and the players it has on it, it could be a really quick line, and potentially a versatile line. So I do think that could be something of interest. Of course, sometimes you bring in players and you hope they mesh right away and they don't. So it could be a question of chemistry throughout the season. Maybe at some point they find it, maybe they don't. Maybe you have to move someone to the fourth line, or maybe even like you're like, okay, this guy doesn't fit in what our game plan is, and you waive them. Like there's a lot of questions, and that is going to be a lot for Scott and I to write this season, especially in the early parts.
Yeah, and of course, like we haven't even mentioned Milan Lucic in this equation yet, because I think everyone's just penciling him in as fourth line left wing, and like, okay, you just stick him there. But maybe he finds a fountain in youth, and like he contributes on a third line. That I'm not expecting that, but while we're tossing all these other names around, like he is there. Like we do have to include him, and I don't think. I know people like cynically think they brought him in just because he's a fan favorite or whatever, but it's like I don't think they're signing him for $1 million just to walk around and wave to fans. Like he does actually have to play and contribute, and it might just be in that fourth line left wing role, and that might be his home, and maybe he's even in and out of the lineup. But they're going to give him a chance to, along with all these other guys, to show that maybe there's still a little more there. So he's in that mix as well. But and as a guy that Frederic can, even if they're not on the same line, like he's someone in sort of that bottom six group that he can potentially lean on and work with. Like I think obviously with Coyle he did because they were line mates, but I think like Trent Frederic learned from Nick Foligno as well. Like I think that was also a good relationship. So it is going to be fascinating because it's a lot of guys, and you can see like a lot of different combinations and things. You mentioned Boqvist's speed, obviously Lauko has some speed as well, and like those are kind of different elements because I think Frederic's probably a better skater than maybe people give him credit for, but it's not like he's a blazer. Morgan Geeky's not super fast. Like skating's been the question mark for him. We know Lucic is was never the fastest and certainly isn't now at 35 years old. So those guys who have some quickness, like I think they're going to be important because you probably want, at least someone who can bring that like on each line, which is why I see, a Boquist or Lauko on that third line, or even, Lysell if he can make a push. But, I think the Bruins wanted to get a little heavier, and they certainly have, but it is also a fast game. So like you can't totally sacrifice that, which is why I think you saw, a signing like Boquist come in late, because I think they're kind of looking and like, yeah, we probably could use another speed guy somewhere in this bottom six mix. And, so you go get him and throw him in and see what he can do. Like, like you guys mentioned, like he hasn't really established himself yet, but like there have been some flashes, here's another guy like Frederic and Geeky that like on a per minutes basis at 5-on-5 last year had pretty good production on the Devils. So, but ultimately fell out of favor in the playoffs when they had a deeper team post trade deadline, and he ended up sort of in and out of their lineup. But yeah, it could go way south where we're like, oh my God, there's no one in the bottom six who can score. Like that's in play. Like that's on the table. It's like the Bruins potentially just might not have very much offense at all in their bottom six. But there, to Brian's point, like there's also that upside of, all right, some of these guys have, promising rate stats and lower roles. Maybe they do blossom. Maybe we see Frederic top 20 goals and 40 points or something. Maybe Geeky does keep producing the way he was in fewer minutes and, takes that level up to a 14-minute role or something. So, there's jobs to be won there, and there are opportunities for guys to show that they can produce. And, we're going to see, but they're going to need it from someone.
Scott, I'm going to raise you this. You said that we could be looking at a bottom six that can't score. There, in my mind, there's a chance that there's only like one line this season, and this could be a storyline too.
Yeah,
there's like a one line this season that might be producing like a majority of the goals, because if you stack the first line, Marchand, Zacha, Pastrnak, what you're left with is Van Riemsdyk, Coyle, DeBrusk. Don't know if that line is going to be a big high scoring line. Boquist, Frederic, Geeky, and then Lucci, Patrick Brown, and Lauko. Or AJ Greer. So if you really think about it, those bottom 9 forwards, or 10 if you're including Greer, they're not the highest scoring people. DeBrusk would be the biggest goal scorer in that bottom 6 grouping that I just listed, but he also had his career year on a line with Marchand and Bergeron, and these are not, like, no offense to Coyle and Van Riemsdyk, but those guys are not Marchand and Bergeron. So like the focus on that line, if that were to be what they roll with for the second line, would be on DeBrusk. He would be the threat that people would more have to focus on. And when you have Bergeron and Marchand on your line, they're drawing focus and leaving DeBrusk open, and that way everything's more balanced. But I mean, we could be talking about that month 2 into the season. Like, okay, well, the first line of Marchand, Zacha, Pastrnak is scoring. Where the hell else are they going to be getting goals from?
Yeah, and I think that's why this is going to be such an interesting season. Like this Bruins team has potential to be a really solid playoff team, and they have the potential to be I don't know, not a bottom 5 team in the East, but they could certainly be they could certainly miss the playoffs, no doubt about it. And that's kind of the risk you take when you kind of moneyball a roster. They've kind of moneyballed this year with some of these players. I mean, obviously, like it's a hard cap. Everybody's spending to the cap, but I'm just saying, like, when you had the season you had last year, and you had to let a lot of these players go because you can't afford them, quite frankly, and you have to pay the bonus overage to Bergeron and Krejci from last year. The Bruins had to try to find some diamonds in the rough and hope that they are indeed diamonds. And Scott asked a question earlier, like, he looks at Trent Frederic and says, can Trent Frederic drive a line, be a driver of a line? And that's my question for Jake DeBrusk. Can Jake DeBrusk be a driver of a line? And there might be some underlying statistics that would show that last year he did in fact drive a lot of offense, being with Bergeron and Marchand. Like, he may have driven some of that offense, because like it's easy to look at that line and be like, well, Bergeron and Marchand drive that line, and DeBrusk was along for the ride, and I'm one of them. But maybe there's some advanced statistics that Scott like looks into, and people like Scott who honestly do dive into those numbers that could say, well, actually DeBrusk did have a lot of offense driven in transition and whatnot from him. But regardless, this cannot be a season where Jake DeBrusk is a passenger at all. He needs to step up. He's, I want to say, 26 years old. He's in his prime, and he's a 30 goal. He's a potential 30 plus goal scorer in this league, and he needs to recognize, along with some of these other younger players, that like aside from Brad Marchand, like the teachers are gone. Like it's time to step up and be these middle NHL veterans now. They're no longer kids. Like, remember like that commercial back in the day, like they're too young, the kids are too young, whatever. It's like they're not kids anymore. Like they're all in their mid-20s, entering the second half of their 20s, and Jake DeBrusk needs to drive that line, because Bridget, you're absolutely right. I'd look at the top six and I say, well, if David Pastrnak goes down, they're screwed. And you could say the same last year, because he's such an important player, but there's a lack of depth right now, and high-end depth. So it'll be interesting to see, and somebody like Jake DeBrusk stepping up, and because I don't expect JVR or Coyle to be driving a line. Coyle is being asked to be a player that I don't think he is. I don't think he's a top 2 center. I think he can carry the weight here and there, but he's not going to drive a second line. JVR at this stage in his career is not going to do that. Jake DeBrusk, he can. Will he? We'll find out.
If I'm being real though with you, I think I've said this before, and I assume this will be how I feel up until we see it for the first time. I actually want Coyle to center Marchand and DeBrusk, and I would prefer to have Van Riemsdyk, Zacha, Pastrnak. Call either one of those the first line, doesn't really matter. One of those is the second line, and that way things are more spread out. And then you're not asking one guy to drive the second line. Like you have, if you have Coyle centering Marchand and DeBrusk, each game somebody different on that line might be able to be the guy that steps up, because Coyle defensively is really good, and he can drive games at times, including in the playoffs when he was moved up when Bergeron and Krejci were out. So I think that balances things better, and then you're not asking so much of, say, DeBrusk, and you keep him with Marchand. I tend to think that's the better option, and then you also are able to keep Zacha with Pasta, and hope Van Riemsdyk balances that line out well enough, and he's kind of the veteran on that line. That's what I think would work best. Obviously, we haven't seen it yet, so that'll be the consideration that has to be made.
Yeah, I agree that makes a lot of sense, because what we're talking about before, where like there's a chance where that second line of Van Riemsdyk, Coyle, DeBrusk goes silent. Like, then you're looking at the 2021-22 team, pre the shakeup that moved Pastrnak off the perfection line, put him with Eric Holla, and like then you finally started to get a second line going. You could be looking at a situation like that. And on DeBrusk, also worth noting, a contract year for him. He's entering the final year of his deal, and he's obviously looking for a payday. Like, this could potentially, if he has a really good season, his next contract could potentially be the biggest payday of his career. And I saw something in the Athletic that they did this week on contract efficiency, which is basically, which teams have guys signed to the best deals and aren't, throwing away money on contracts that project to be bad, or, players who aren't projected to live up to their contracts. And the Bruins still ranked 4th in the NHL. So the main takeaway there isn't necessarily that they have like the 4th best roster or anything. It's that they don't have many bad contracts, or certainly not anything that they're tied into long term that's going to hurt them. But while looking at that, DeBrusk's value based on this model, which comes from the Athletic's Dom Lucian, who's like their super advanced stats guy. Based on like last year and projecting going forward, his value is 8.2 million, which I don't think Jake DeBrusk is going to get unless he like really goes off for like a 40 goal season or something. But there certainly is a scenario where he has another good year and he's looking at, he's making 4 million right now, looking at like a pay jump to the 6.5 range, something like a Taylor Hall contract. Like, let's be honest, he was more productive than Taylor Hall last year. Now part of that's the line he's playing on, but I also don't think it's a stretch at all to say that he just straight up had a better season. So he has that in play too. And yeah, whether that's, playing with Marchand and Coyle and helping to elevate that line because we know Coyle isn't Bergeron, or on, what Coyle, Van Riemsdyk, whatever it is, where he's the go-to guy on a second line. Like, yeah, it's a huge year for him, both because of his role on the team and what he's going to mean to their success this year, because you can't just have Pastrnak and Marchand providing all the offense. Other guys have to step up, and DeBrusk should be, him and Zacha, like the third and fourth guys in terms of production. And he has a huge opportunity here to help the team and also help himself going forward and earn, a sizable payday.
And he's another storyline, not just for the on the ice stuff this season, but because of the contract coming up, he's, if they're buyers or sellers, say the Bruins are not as good as we expect them to be. They're not a playoff team. They become sellers. Do they sell Jake DeBrusk? Do they extend him during the season? Do they wait for free agency to start and he kind of just gets to go out there and find his price? That's another storyline that has nothing to do with how the team, with how he's playing necessarily, because those are more off the ice things. And besides maybe the being traded at the deadline, if he's created value for another team that might want him. And we've mentioned before about adding a center. Maybe that's what route they go at some point during the season. We don't know yet. Maybe they'll be buyers. We don't know. So just another storyline with him.
Actually, funny enough, I was just looking at Taylor Hall's statistics because when you brought up the fact that DeBrusk outperformed him last year, it's interesting that last year the Bruins were so dynamic offensively and all around. He only had 36 points last year. Taylor Hall did, and I know he was playing a lot of third line minutes and whatnot, but yeah, I find that interesting. Now he played 61 games, so he didn't play a full 82 game season. But in any event, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, like Jake DeBrusk, in the future could definitely be making $6 million if he has a good year. And yeah, Bridget, to your point, we'll see how the year shakes out, and maybe they are selling Jake DeBrusk at the deadline. And it's never great to give away a top 6 talent, but.
Mm-hmm. But if you don't think you're going to be able to re-sign him, then you got to get something back.
Exactly, and that's definitely a cross that bridge when we get to it. But you're right. That's why, like, I don't know. There's an excitement level to this season of like, I have no idea what to expect right now. This season's like a mystery airhead. I have no idea what flavor is coming out of this package right now. It is insane. Question for you guys: do you think the Bruins ideally want to be spending and allocating around $10 million in goaltending next season if Swayman were to get a pay raise and you're paying Allmark $5 million? I know the cap's going to go up. I know they're going to have more cap space available for them next season, but is that an ideal figure to be spending on goaltending, around $10 million? Whether it's, I know some teams spend almost $10 million for one goalie, but I'm just going to ask you guys that question.
No, I don't really think it is. We talked this offseason about, hey, if the right deal's out there, it might be time to trade Allmark. Mostly we focused on Allmark, but I guess potentially Swayman. Yeah, if Swayman's going to if he has another really good season, you are probably looking at a jump into the $4.5-5 million salary range. And yeah, I don't think that's ideal, especially if, I'll say Brennan Bussey because he's probably the most notable, but say Bussey's ready. Like, ultimately, between Bussey, Kyle Kaiser, Michael DiPietro, like if any of those guys are ready, you can't bury them in the minus forever. So that's an easy way to get cheaper at the position. So yeah, I think trading a goalie, whether it's, if they fade this year and they're not really in it come trade deadline time, it could be then or next summer when Allmark's going into the final year of his deal. Like, I think that's absolutely on the table. And it's not even, look, having a great goaltending duo is awesome. And if Allmark and Swayman are even 90% of what they were last year, then the Bruins are still going to win a lot of games and pretty comfortably be a playoff team. Like, really good goaltending gets you that far. But at some point, yeah, having $10 million tied up at that position gets harder to justify. And, especially if you're a team that's going to be looking for a 1 or 2 center and you're going to need money to be able to do that because that's going to be an expensive player. Yeah, that's a very obvious spot to potentially deal away from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have no interest in spending that much money on goaltending. I don't think you need to. Yeah, in a year like this where offense might be a challenge for Boston outside of David Pastrnak, you're going to need that goaltending when this is your roster. But you don't need to be spending. And look, I'm not trying to pull a recency bias and look around the league. And I know, I mean, you just don't. I mean, Tampa Bay, look, they had Andre Vasilevsky, sure, but and they paid him whatever he was worth because he was the best goaltender in the world. But you see it with Vegas this past year. Like you saw it with St. Louis with Binnington. You've seen it in Chicago. Chicago won 3 cups, and I think they did it with 2 goalies or 3 goalies. I don't even know. I think it was 2. It's just you can find goaltending. It's the most important position on the ice, but it's not the most. You can find good goaltending a lot easier than you can find, or at least serviceable goaltending. If you have a good starter, you can find a replaceable. I mean, look at the Bruins in the last decade. I mean, when they were spending all that money on Tuukka Rask, like they had no choice but to spend cheaper backups. I mean, look at the Rolodex of guys that were on the Bruins behind Tuukka Rask since, call it, 2014. I mean, I'll miss some names, but you had Alex Auld, you had Anton Khudobin, you had Yaroslav Halak. There's probably a couple other guys I'm just blanking on.
Svedberg.
What's his name? Went to Calgary.
Vladar.
I mean, look, I just think if you find your guy, and if the guy's Swayman, I just think you might just try to move Allmark at some point next year. But anyway, I agree with you, Scott. I don't think you need to spend $10 million next year. So if Swayman's getting a pay raise next year from Boston, then Allmark's got to go. But that's not for this year. I was more so talking about next year.
So you're saying only one more season of goalie hugs?
Mm-hmm. And I don't think there'll be 61 of them this year or whatever it was last year.
Probably not.
What did we have last year? 65 in regular season? 60.
Yeah.
What's the old record?
I don't think. Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I think they ended up at 65.
Yeah, they'll be lucky if they end up around. They'll probably end up around 45 to 50 goalie hugs this year, probably. If they're lucky with the 50. I mean, probably around 45, and they'll need some. Yeah. Anyway, but yes, probably the last season of goalie hugs, regardless of how many there are. Okay, guys. Any final takeaways from this week?
The one big story to kind of keep an eye on around the league right now is that the whole Hockey Canada scandal from the World Junior team several years ago. There was a report this morning from Andy Strickland from the Cam and Strick podcast that he's hearing that 5 notable players around the NHL are going to be suspended as a result of this sexual assault investigation. I think it was the 2019 World Junior team. He worded it in a weird way where he said he's heard the names, but he's not going to share them or whatever. But that's none of them are Bruins. So no direct Bruins tie, but if you look like at that team, there's some pretty big names on that roster, and some of those guys have already been cleared because they weren't even like at this event where it took place. But yeah, not a good story, but something that seems to kind of be coming down the pike in the next little bit before the season starts.
Yeah, that's kind of one that has been on the back burner for a while. So the like new news on that is going to be interesting. Impossible to really think of, speculate on who. So we'll have to wait to see when that comes out. But that, I mean, 5 notable players, you said, Scott, but that doesn't mean it's just 5 players. Like, it could be more.
True. Yeah. I mean, because I do think there's a couple guys from that team who like aren't in the NHL anymore. So I don't guess they wouldn't qualify as notable. I mean, I don't know, but yeah, very obviously bad situation. And, I'm certainly not going to guess or speculate on the names, but yeah, that was so a little bit of news that broke like shortly before we started recording.
Yep. Yeah, and I don't really have anything that we haven't already covered. This is mostly a arbitration / avoiding arbitration conversation, and I know we also talked a lot about what the lineup looks like. We didn't talk at all about the defense, but that's because that's the one area where there should be a little bit less drama. Goaltending too, like that, there shouldn't be anything dramatic going on with goaltending. You wouldn't think. Those are 2 really good goalies, both locked up now. I trust both of them. Defense, feel like you trust still. So the drama comes with the mixed matched lines up in the forward group. So yeah, I guess that's our takeaway for today.
Yeah, I mean, up on the back end, I mean, take out the 20 games from Orlov you had after the deadline last year in the playoffs. I mean, it's the same defense and the same goaltending. You're just replacing Connor Clifton with Kevin Shattenkirk. I mean, 1 through 6, they're still I mean, in my opinion, they're still a top 5 decor in the league. I mean, arguably top 3 probably. So it's just a matter of upfront for me. Now, can they have a bad year? Sure, but there's nothing based on the personnel and what I've seen out of them as a group for the last handful of years, even without Hampus Lindholm, before he came to Boston. Like, their track record speaks for itself. The defense and the goaltending shouldn't be a question. There might be some off nights, but overall, they shouldn't be a question. It's up front where this team has to carry the weight more so than maybe what the personnel is projecting.
Also, so I just noticed this, and I don't know when they updated it, but cap friendly currently, it's like if people happen to look while listening, they do have the Bruins under the cap right now, but that's because they sent down Jason Megna from the forward group. So they do have a 22-man roster, and I think so they have 8 defensemen on the Bruins NHL roster. I would think the Bruins would be more likely to have 13 forwards, 7 defensemen than 12 forwards, 8 defensemen. So that's why, like, I talk as if Lauko's on the NHL roster, or you could, if you think someone's going to beat him out or whatever, but a 13th forward in there, which is why we mentioned earlier, like, you could waive Ian Mitchell, or I guess if like Jacob Zaboral has a bad camp, it could be him. Either one of those guys has to go through waivers, so you do risk losing them if you waive them. Obviously, if they go unclaimed, you can then send them to Providence. But yeah, just wanted to clarify. That's why we were talking about potentially sending a defenseman down, even though cap friendly does say that the Bruins are under the cap right now.
All right, great clarification there from Scott, as always. Before we wrap it up, so if you guys have nothing else, I think that'll probably do it. So thank you all very much for listening, and we will talk to you very soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.